Friends, hello there. Welcome to part 4 in our series entitled The Bread of Life. And before we jump into this part, I just want to make you aware of something that some of you may be interested in. Many of you know that I lead biblical study hiking trips to the Middle East. We go to Israel and we also go to Turkey. And I wanted to let you know that we still have spots available on our August Turkey trip. Now, Turkey is one of these gems that when people go, they have no idea what they're going to get to see. And when they get there, they are absolutely blown away by seeing what they get to see, experiencing what they get to experience. And people always go, I had no idea this was in Turkey. I love the Turkey trip as much as I love the Israel trip. And so if you would be interested in going August 11 to 22 this year, take a look at the study trips tab at walkingthetext.com. And I'd love for you to go check out more about this Turkey trip to see if this isn't something that God may be calling you to join. Alrighty, so we are in the midst of this Bread of Life series, and my, oh my, I mean, just the last 2 weeks on the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000, just on what's going on. From numbers, we've gotten a little bit into numerology, we've looked at the context going on there, and we have understood a lot more in these stories, I believe, than what we generally get just at reading it at a surface level. But we're doing this Bread of Life series centered around this passage from John 6:35 when Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. And this is a passage we'll look more at in John 6 beginning next week. And so we'll come back to, again, what's the context for Jesus saying that is in the midst of one of the feedings. But what I want to do today is come on the heels of the feeding of the 5,000, and we mentioned that this was in all 4 Gospels, very, very rare for this to be there. Jesus feeding the 5,000, and he walks on water. And again, this kind of is a collective pair of stories, if you will. And it shows up in all 4 Gospels. Absolutely mind-blowing that happens. And then also the feeding of the 4,000, which just Matthew and Mark highlight. And so in both the feeding of the 5,000, we read the Mark account. In the feeding of the 4,000, we read the Mark account, and we're going to pick up in Mark. That's why I've been doing that the last couple weeks, so we could get to the story that I want to look at today. But just a reminder to us that the feeding of the 5,000 took place somewhere here in the vicinity of this evangelical triangle. Again, Bargle Pixner, that was what he coined that as. And then last week, the feeding of the 4,000 took place over here in the Decapolis on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. So we're going to pick up the story again here in Mark chapter 8. We left off last week at verse 9, where it says about 4,000 were present. And then it says, after he had sent them away, he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmanutha. Now, we don't know where Dalmanutha is, but in the other accounts it talks about Magadan, which is the area of Magdala. So if I just show you back here on a map, it's this area around the plain of Gennesaret. So they've just been somewhere over here in the Decapolis, and now they've gone across the lake to over here. And then, this is what we pick up again here in Mark 8. It says, verse 11, the Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. Now, this sign from heaven is going to come up again in the John 6 account that we're going to look at next week. So where Jesus calls himself the bread of life, it's on the heels of the whole sign thing, and I'll unpack that for you then. But they're asking for a sign from heaven. And Jesus sighed deeply and said, why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to it. Now, in Matthew's version, which we looked at last week, Jesus then talks about the sign of Jonah. So Matthew included that, Mark does not. But here's what Mark is getting at. Mark is kind of paving the way for what comes next. He says, then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. And they discussed this with one another and said, is it because we have no bread? Oh, like, you can't make this stuff up. I mean, Jesus is going to remind them what they just went through, okay? But then you have this. Jesus is aware of their discussion. Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. Okay, let's pause for a moment. This is why we're looking at the numbers in the previous episodes, because right here, Jesus goes, don't you remember with those 5 loaves and I fed the 5,000, how many basketfuls? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. Jesus said to them, do you still not understand? Now, if we had not gone through and did what we did over the last 2 weeks, none of us would have understood what's happening in this moment if we just jumped in at verse 9, not having any context for what has happened. But the disciples had gone through it, but they hadn't understood what was going on. So now here's what's fascinating about this, is it says they're back in the boat, and in verse 22 it says, then they came to Bethsaida. So let me just show you again here what's going on here in Mark chapter 8, because they're now on their way to Bethsaida because they just had a conversation about bread. But even prior to that, the way they got onto that is Jesus said, be careful, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. And you go, yeast, like what is that all about? Now, for us today, like if we want to have yeast, we generally go to the grocery store, we get a packet of it, we put it into our bread, and that's how, we do bread. But in the ancient world, yeast was a piece of dough that was left over from a previous batch or from the prior batch. And then when you took that piece of dough and you put it in with the new batch of grain that you had put together and water and flour and all of that, then what you have is that batch of old dough has gotten carbon dioxide in it, and then it invades the rest of the batch and it moves all throughout and it influences the whole batch, and that's how you have yeast, or that's how you have leaven. That's how leaven works in the ancient world. Now, leaven is used in both positive and negative contexts in the scriptures. At one point, Jesus says this in Matthew 13:33. Jesus told them still another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into 3 measures of flour until it worked all throughout the dough. So here is something that is using yeast in a positive sense. And what Jesus is talking about here is the same thing he's talking about in the boat with his disciples. He's just using the negative connotation. And that's this. Jesus is telling stories about the kingdom of heaven, about how it doesn't appear to be really influential, but it's actually invading everything. And so when Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like yeast, it's this little piece of dough that gets mixed into the new batch, and that little dough has massive power because it influences everything. And what Jesus does with his disciples is he says, listen, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. Now, I'm going to tell you what that yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod is in just a few moments, okay? But now they've gotten in the boat. They're talking about this. They're saying, is Jesus saying this because we don't have no bread? Like, who forgot to bring all the bread? We've only got 1 loaf here. And Jesus is like, oh, fellas, come on. Which, by the way, like in the Gospel of Mark, like the disciples are always struggling to understand who Jesus is. In fact, the one people group who's crystal clear on who Jesus is in the Gospel of Mark, the demons. Crystal clear on who Jesus is. Disciples, not so much. So Jesus asks them about the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. And so we get this as we continue Mark, and we know that Jesus has done the feeding of the 5,000 here to the religious Jews, and Jesus did the feeding of the 4,000 to the pagans, the Gentiles, the non-Jews, predominantly non-Jews, here in the Decapolis. And what's fascinating about this is that they've just sailed from here to the plain of Gennesaret, somewhere around here, and now they're going to Bethsaida. And I just believe that part of what Jesus is saying is he says, fellas, when I fed, the 5,000 with 5 loaves, how many basketfuls did you pick up on that hill? I mean, they're going right between the two areas. And then Jesus goes, and how about the 7 loaves for the 4,000? How many did you pick up? Like he's pointing to the two. Everything is so close together. In fact, not long ago, my buddy Mark and I were on the Sea of Galilee, and we took some drone footage to kind of give you an idea. Well, not just for this teaching, but, that I could use. But notice how close the hills are. This is actually looking south down the Sea of Galilee, but everything is so tight. And if we would have just kind of kept the drone, keep coming around, you would have seen the direction this way. But Jesus is probably just pointing it out. He's saying, fellas, what happened right there? What happened over there? And who lives in those places, right? He's highlighting the numbers for them. Now, what's interesting is that Jesus hears them having this discussion. They're not in a boat like this size. Like, friends, they're in a boat that's like this size. And so it sounds like they're having this conversation far away, and Jesus is kind of like, listen, no, that's like right there. And Jesus is like, fellas, what are you doing? And he says to them, listen, don't you remember how many basketfuls you picked up there and over there? And by the way, friends, these are huge baskets. This is probably kind of like the basket that they would have used. And you go, if they're picking up scraps, leftovers from, remember, 5,000 men, 4,000 men. Right? So with women and children, we're talking maybe, 8, 9, 10,000 for the first one, 7, 8, 9,000 for the second one. How much time did it take for the disciples to pick up all of those pieces of bread? And it's almost like they didn't get it. And Jesus is like, dudes, do you not understand? And it's like crickets, right? I'm not sure what's going on here. And so now they're going off to Bethsaida. And this is what we pick up. Man, if you just read these stories outside of the narrative flow, it's like so easy to get lost in what's going on. But when you start putting them together, you go, oh, I see why the stories happened and unfolded this way. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked him, do you see anything? He looked up and said, I see people. They look like trees walking around. Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And Jesus sent him home saying, don't even go into the village. Now, they go to Bethsaida. Bethsaida, again, we don't have time to go into all the options and why that is, but we've got probably a Bethsaida Julius, and we probably have just a regular Bethsaida in Galilee right here. Here is probably Bethsaida Julius. This is the archaeological excavation right here. It's off the water. But then up here, we have another site called El Araj. This one is called Et Tel. This one is called El Araj. This is Bethsaida. We don't know which one this is happening at, but we know it's got to be either like here or here. It's right here that the story takes place. Now, what happens is that Jesus goes into the village. So he either goes into El Araj or he goes in here to Et Tel, and he pulls this blind man out of the city. This is not for everybody else. This is just for the disciples. And he does the healing the first time. And again, if you don't read this in context, you go, did Jesus mess up? Is he messing with the dude? Like, why does he have to heal him twice? But notice what Jesus is doing. Is he has just said to his disciples, like, do you not get what's going on? Do you have eyes but fail to see? And he goes and he heals the blind man somewhere in this area. And he says, hey, dude, you see anything? He's like, yeah, I see people. They look like trees walking around, which means he must have had his sight at some point in time to know what trees are. But then Jesus, quote unquote, heals him again, and the dude can see clearly. And I believe what Jesus is doing in that moment is he is saying to the disciples, this is you. Like, I can do these miracles, but if you don't internalize the significance of what I am doing, it's almost as if these stories have never happened. And he says to his disciples, you think you see clearly, but you're seeing completely fuzzy. And Jesus is waking them up to the reality that they haven't seen clearly. And I believe that what Jesus is doing in this moment is he is saying, I need you to understand that when I healed those 5,000, that was me taking care of the Jews. And when I fed those 4,000, plus women and children, I'm taking care of the Gentiles. That disciples, my mission is for all people. And when Jesus got to that region of the plains of Gennesaret, Dalmanutha, Magadan, however, it gets played out in the scriptures, it's that area, and the Pharisees want a sign. They want Jesus to prove why he's doing what he is doing. And for Jesus, he says to the disciples, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees. And what the yeast of the Pharisees is that the Pharisees believed that there were only certain people that were in God's good graces, that there were only certain people that God was going to save, that there were only certain people who were invited, if you will, to God's table. And what Jesus did is he came along and he broke down those boundaries. He broke down that understanding, and he said, my ministry is for both Jews and Gentiles, i.e., my ministry is for the entire world. And for so long, the Israelites had this assertion that they were just God's people and the message was just for them. But when Jesus comes along, Jesus goes, actually, God has used the Israelite people to bring to the story to this culminating moment. But what Paul reminds us of in Ephesians 2 is that Jesus came to create one new humanity. And that what Jesus was doing was inviting everyone to be fully human, to be their truest selves, which was to come into a relationship with Jesus Christ. And this was for Jew and this was for Gentile. And predominantly among the Pharisees, predominantly among the religious leaders, was this understanding that God's love, God's grace, God's forgiveness, it only extended to certain people. There were certain people that were allowed to eat at the table of God, if you will, and there were certain people who were not. And Jesus goes, that is entirely false. And I believe this is what Jesus challenged his disciples with on that day, was to be reminded about what his ministry was all about. And that ultimately, one of the things that we see is that here in Ezekiel 12, 1-2, is one of the passages that talks about eyes to see but don't see, ears to hear that don't hear. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, you are living among a rebellious people. They have eyes to see but do not see, and ears to hear but do not hear, for they are a rebellious people. And when Jesus says to his disciples, he says, you have eyes to see but do not see, you have ears to hear but do not hear. He's saying this to his disciples, don't be rebellious. Like when you understand what I am saying, when you understand my word, don't just affirm it, actually live it. Don't rebel against my word by just informing it, I wouldn't say informing it, I would just say like affirming it. That's the word I'm looking for here. It's been a long day. Affirming it, but actually living it. And it just leads me to this question which says, how are we doing in loving all people well? That we can say Jesus came for all people, that for God so loved the world, that in this season where we're reminded that Jesus went to a cross on behalf of all people, we can say we believe that, but how are we functionally living that? How are we treating people at work? How are we treating, kids at school? How are we treating family members that we are really, really struggling with? How are we dealing with those neighbors that are just like the nuisance to us? How are we loving all people well? Because one of the things that we have been talking about in this series is that as we move towards the cross, as we move towards Resurrection Sunday, friends, we are reminded that Jesus went to the cross for all people. And that his love and his grace and his mercy and his forgiveness are for all people. And if you're someone right now who is just struggling and you are in an addiction and your relationship with your spouse is breaking down, or you're having problems, or you're navigating some just really challenging waters and you just feel horrible about yourself, I hope this is good news for you, just to be reminded that Jesus wants to journey with you in the midst of your story. But then likewise, I think there are times where we look on other people, people who don't vote like us, people who are for this person who's in, a particular position that maybe when we say their name, we vomit in our throat, right? Or there are certain things that we engage with someone and we just go, man, we have this sense inside of us that, and they're just different and I just feel very uncomfortable around them or their beliefs or whatever. And it's like Jesus is asking us, like, don't just functionally say that you affirm something, like actually live it out. If you don't just affirm that you're saying that I love all people and that you ought to love all people, but how are you actually living it out? And as one of our goals during this Lenten season is to become closer to Jesus, I believe we can become closer to Jesus by becoming closer to the people he loves, which is all people. And so this is a theme that we've talked about in this series. This is a theme we'll talk about again and again because Jesus' entire ministry is around loving all people well. And what he said to his disciples, he says, you think you're understanding this story? You're blind. Get clarity. Don't be rebellious. Live it out. Don't just affirm. Actually love people well. And so, friends, as you just take this with you today, as you take this throughout this week, I just pray that the Holy Spirit would just challenge and confront us on the people that we're not loving well. And that we would be confronted with that we would change course, and that if we feel like we're the recipient of being unloved right now because we're going through something, that you would just be reminded in this teaching just how much Jesus loves you, how much God loves you, how much he is for you, and how much he wants to help you as you navigate the challenging waters of your story. So thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. So appreciate you joining me for this teaching series, and may we all walk out this text well in our lives.